Good evening and welcome to our webinar, Understanding Sexuality and Gender in a Non-Binary World. My name is Nicole Imgrand and I am the owner and director of Rivers Edge Counseling Center here in St. Albert. And this webinar is a part of our Wellness Matters series. We have several talks and webinars every month here at the center on mental health and wellness topics. And if you go to our website, riversedgecounseling.com, to the events page, you'll see all of our upcoming talks and webinars for this coming year, and we would love to have you at any of them. Our facilitator for the talk this evening is Grant Wardlow. For more than 2 years now, Grant has been a valued member of the Rivers Edge Counseling Center team. He works with adolescents, adults, and couples in areas of depression, anxiety, grief and loss, personal and spiritual growth, sexual and gender identity, and issues pertaining to self-image, self-esteem, and self-worth. Thank you for presenting with us today, Grant. I would just like to remind the participants that let you know that the webinar, the presentation will be about an hour this evening, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. You're welcome to use the chat function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation in case you have any tech issues or questions for me. And also under the Q&A tab, you'll have a place to ask your questions. Those questions will come to Grant and I, and Grant will address them at the end of his presentation. The webinar is being recorded this evening, and it will be added to the website, and I'll also send each of you a link later. So if there's something you'd like to watch again, you'll have a chance to see that. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Grant.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. This is my first time that I'm hosting a webinar, and so please be patient with me as I maneuver around some of the new technology. I do want to say a couple of things. Nicole mentioned that we'll address questions at the end. And also, at the end of my talk, I do have a short, roughly about a 10-minute TED Talk that I would like to present that encompasses gender and sexuality in a way that is, in a holistic way, that I think is kind of interesting and different. So I think you'll find that really interesting. So let me just share this. Get this up and running. Okay. So if I had to describe tonight's talk in a word, it would be diversity. People today are defining and expressing themselves in ways that extend beyond the sexual parameters of gay and straight, and beyond the gender parameters of man and woman, and masculine and feminine. More and more people are moving away from an either-or thinking, in other words, you're either a man or a woman, to recognize that you can also identify as both man and woman, or neither. And it gets a bit confusing because in the last decade or so, there have been a plethora of changes to the way that people understand themselves and express themselves, and in the language they use to do so. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight relates to terminology, so let's begin. The first thing I want to talk about is, and define, is the term sex. So sex is different than gender, although in today's society we often see them used interchangeably. But really when we're talking about sex, we're talking about someone's biological makeup. Okay, so we're talking about chromosomes, reproductive organs, hormones, and genitalia. Now, in most cases, a person's sex is designated as either male or female. So when an infant is born, the person who is performing the birth looks at the genitalia and pronounces it's a boy or it's a girl. However, in approximately about 1 in 1,500 births, there's some type of biological variance that causes these individuals to be identified as intersex, of which there are roughly about 67 different known variations. Now, what's interesting about our sexual designation is that it really separates us and puts us on a path of societal and cultural expectations. And this designation has a really significant impact in our lives, because through the process of gender socialization, we learn appropriate behaviors, what to wear, what language to use, the types of jobs that we should aspire to, and it even impacts and affects one's expectations in terms of our sexuality. So tonight we are going to be I just want to get that out of the way, but tonight we're going to be talking about sexuality. Now, when I talk about sexuality, I'm going to be talking about it in terms of 3 elements: sexual orientation, sexual identity, and sexual behavior. We're also going to be talking about gender, and the 2 elements that compose gender are gender identity and gender expression. Now, what's important to note here is that sexuality and gender are not simple expressions of the underlying biological foundation of our sex. In other words, our sex does not determine our sexuality, nor does it determine our gender. Just because I was born a male does not mean that I will necessarily identify as a man, that I will express myself in masculine ways, or that I will be heterosexual. Sexuality and gender, rather, they occur on a spectrum, and they are not necessarily fixed states, okay? And it's important to note that there is no right or wrong combination of sexuality or gender. Now, we'll often hear individuals, different political organizations, and religious institutions that work towards oppressing any diversity outside of being cisgender and heterosexual. But it is my belief that any variance is just that, is that it is a variance. Okay, so moving on, what is gender? Gender is a social construct based on societal views, stereotypes, and beliefs regarding the fundamental nature of what it means to be a man or woman, or neither, or both. So there are 2 components: gender identity and gender expression. Now, when we talk about one's gender identity, we're talking about their internal, deeply held sense of their gender. For the majority of people, their gender identity as man or woman matches the sex that they were assigned at birth, male or female. This is known as cisgender. So for example, I am cisgender. I was given the designation of male when I was born, and I identify as a man. However, for those whose gender identity does not align with their sex, they fall under the transgender umbrella, of which there are many types of gender identities. Now, the next part of gender is gender expression. These are the external manifestations of gender that are expressed through one's name, their pronouns of choice, clothing, haircut, behavior, voice, and mannerisms. Now, society generally defines gender expression as either masculine or feminine, but it's important to note that masculine and feminine changes over time and varies across culture. So what is considered masculine in one culture is not necessarily considered masculine in another culture. Now, typically, transgender individuals seek to make their gender expression align with their gender identity rather than the sex that they were assigned at birth. So let's look at some of the ways transgender individuals identify themselves. So the transgender umbrella is a term for people whose gender identity and or gender expression differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, individuals who identify under the transgender umbrella describe themselves using a variety of terms, one of which is transgender. So some of the more common transgender identity labels include agender. So this would be someone who does not identify as having a particular gender. Someone who is bigender, their gender identity encompasses two genders. Someone who identifies as gender fluid does not identify as having a fixed gender. Rather, their understanding and expression of themselves is more fluid and fluctuates between man and woman and masculinity and femininity. Someone who's pangender is someone who is inclusive of all genders. Someone who is genderqueer would be someone who doesn't necessarily subscribe to the conventional gender distinctions, but rather identifies as neither, both, or some combination. Someone who's gender nonconforming does not conform to the cultural or societal expectations of gender identity or expression. Someone who's non-binary sees gender as not exclusively man or woman, masculine or feminine, which clearly falls outside of our understanding of cisnormality. Now, we also have people who identify as transgender, and more often as transgender female or transgender male. So someone who's transgender female would be someone who was given the designation of male at birth, but understands themselves as a gendered being, as a woman. Someone who identifies as a transgender male would be someone who was given the designation of female at birth, yet identifies as a man. Now, you'll also see in the literature MTF or FTM, which is shorthand for male to female or female to male. Now, we also see people who identify as transsexuals or transsexual male or transsexual female. Now, these are individuals who have undergone sexual reassignment surgery, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, we use the word transition to refer to the change of expression that takes place in order to match a person's gender identity. So this can take many forms and is very individualistic. Transitioning is not a one-step procedure. It is a complex process that occurs for many people over a long period of time. Now, transition includes some or all of the following: personal, legal, and medical steps. So in terms of a personal transition, you can think of this in terms of the social aspects. So this would include telling one's family, friends, or coworkers, using a different name, using new pronouns, starting to dress differently. In terms of a legal transition, this would include changing one's name and or sex on legal documents. Now, up until recently, this was really problematic for people who identified as transgender and who wanted to change their name and or sex on their legal documents, because for a long time it was required that they provide proof that they have undergone sexual reassignment surgery. But because not every transgender individual undergoes that operation, it was unfair that they couldn't change their sex or their name on legal documents. So as recently, I think it was in 2015, in Alberta that change takes place. Now, in terms of medical transition, some individuals choose to undergo hormone replacement therapy. This is done to promote the development of secondary sexual characteristics. So, for example, in the case of someone transitioning from male to female, they would take estrogens and anti-androgens to promote breast development, as well as feminine patterns of hair, fat, and muscle distribution. Others choose to have different procedures, commonly known as sexual reassignment surgery. Now, not all transgender people choose to or can afford to undergo such treatments. Now, when I talk about sexual reassignment surgery, that's often what we see in the literature. However, the community has adopted more appropriate terminology, and you'll often hear it referred to as gender affirmation surgery or gender confirmation surgery. Now, the exact number of steps involved in the transition process varies from person to person, and it's really important to note that there's no prerequisite for identifying as transgender. So you don't have to have changed your name, you don't have to be on pronouns. If you understand yourself as a transgender person, that is enough to identify as being transgender. So when we talk about the transgender community, I just want to bring to light some terms to avoid. One of the most problematic terms is the term transgendered, okay? The preferred terminology is just transgender. In the same way that you wouldn't say that Elton John is gayed or Ellen DeGeneres is lesbian, you would not say that Chaz Bono or Caitlyn Jenner is transgendered. They are just transgender. We also want to avoid the term transgenderism. Now, you don't see this term very often. However, it's sometimes used by anti-transgender activists to dehumanize transgender people and reduce them to a condition. Other defamatory language includes describing transgender people as deceptive or pretending or posing, or calling them, identifying them as tranny, she-male, or it, or shim. How to be a transgender ally. This is something that I wanted to touch on because I think it's really important. And one of the first things that we want to be aware of in terms of becoming a transgender ally is with respect to coming out. So if someone tells you that they're transgender, it means that they trust you. Now, it's really, really important that you don't break that trust. Just because someone tells you that they're transgender doesn't mean that it's okay to tell anyone else. And it's really important not to do so, because if that individual isn't emotionally ready to come out to more than just you, you can do serious, serious damage. Okay? You put them at risk. You put their health at risk in some cases. Okay? Other things that we want to watch out for. Asking someone their real name implies that their chosen name is invalid. Okay? So don't ask a transgender individual what their real name is. Also, don't inquire about their genitalia. Unless you are engaged in a sexual relationship with that person, it's none of your business. Okay? So do not ask. Now, if you're unsure of someone's preferred pronouns, of either he, she, or the singular they, use their chosen name or simply ask the question, what are your preferred pronouns? Now, I just want to point out that in 2015, the American Dialect Society chose the singular they as their word of the year. And I think this is really important to acknowledge because it really speaks to the change in language that's happening and this movement away from the binary to recognize that not everyone identifies as such. Now, we also want to avoid using transphobic words. When we hear such words, we want to challenge them. Otherwise, we're just perpetuating a negative stereotype. Now, we also don't want to make assumptions about a transgender individual's sexuality. No matter how someone identifies their gender, they are free to express themselves and understand themselves as sexual beings in any way that they want. I just want to read this. This comes from the Public Health Agency of Canada, and it's a booklet called Gender Identity in Schools. It looks like this. And the question here is, do people choose to be gender variant? So it says, research on the development of gender variant identities suggests that it is linked to a number of factors, including neurological, hormonal, biological, social, and relational influences, and is not a passing phase. Instead, the development of gender identity, including a gender variant identity, occurs in stages across the lifespan. Studies on gender variant individuals suggest that the awareness and experience of being different begins as a child, and that there is a long history of internal tension between the individual's anatomical sex and their sense of their gender that extends into adolescence and in some cases beyond. So we don't have a full understanding of why someone is transgender, what makes them transgender. It was once explained to me in a very simplistic term, which I still kind of think of, and it works for me, is that during the pregnancy, the body may have been mapped as one sex, the brain was mapped as another. That is the simplest that I've been able to understand it as. So now let's move on to sexuality. When we talk about sexuality, we're talking about three different elements: sexual orientation, sexual identity, and sexual behavior. And I just want to point out quickly that while there is no history for sex itself, because that's hardwired into our being, there is history when it comes to sexuality. And it actually wasn't until 1868 when there was a distinction made in recorded history that differentiated people as either heterosexual or homosexual. So it hasn't always been humanity's understanding of sexuality. I also want to say that as of May 19th of this year, there were still 76 countries worldwide with laws against sexual relations between people of the same sex. And in 10 of those countries, the punishment for homosexual acts can be death. So when we're talking about sexual orientation, this is your internal felt sense of who you are attracted to. So you see someone on the subway or in a class or at work, and that little twinge happens inside of you. That is your internal sense of being attracted to that person. Now, there are different patterns of sexual attraction that can include physical attraction, emotional attraction, affectionate, psychological, as well as spiritual attraction. Now, it's not a choice or a lifestyle, but you can choose to act or pursue the attraction. Now, while it's usually constant and stable over time, for some people, it can change over time. For some people, the circumstances may not present themselves, or they may not allow themselves to entertain the possibility that they might be anything other than heterosexual. Now, when it comes to sexual identity, this is who we say we are to the world. This is a pronouncement of who we are. And for many people, unless they say otherwise, it's assumed that they're straight. Now, There's the obvious. Heterosexual or straight people are attracted to people of the opposite sex. Homosexuals, also known as gays and lesbians, are attracted to people of the same sex. Bisexual people are attracted to both same and opposite sex individuals. Then you have queer people. Now, queer was a term that was reclaimed by the LGBTQ plus community, and people that I know who identify as queer identify so because they don't see themselves fitting into the ideas of being gay or lesbian or homosexual. So it's a way of sort of distancing themselves from those labels. Now, you'll see at the bottom of your page there, that large acronym, LGBTTTIQQAAPP. Oftentimes we see the condensed version of that as just LGBT or LGBTQ or LGBTQ+. Now, I'm just going to go through the acronym so that you have an understanding of what all the letters mean. So, lesbian, G for gay, B for bi, T for transgender, transsexual, and two-spirited, I for intersex, Q for queer and questioning, A for asexual, as well as ally, and the two P's, the first one is pansexual, pan meaning all, so they have a physical or emotional attraction to any gender, and the last one is polysexual, so poly meaning many, so there could be so individuals could be attracted to any sex and attracted to some, but not necessarily all sexes or genders. Now, what's interesting is that you'll see the top, I've put heterosexual / cisgender. And the way that society has sort of dealt with everyone who isn't heterosexual or cisgender is to lump us together. So oftentimes we think of the LGBTQ community as a sexual minority community, when really it is both a sexual minority and a gender minority community. And what's interesting is that while there is overlap between sexuality and gender, the two terms are very different. Now, when it comes to sexual behavior, this is who you have sex with and the kind of sex that you choose to have. Now, motivations for sexual behavior can include love, loneliness, experimentation, societal expectations or religious expectations, or even familial expectations. Now, I just want to point out that sexual behavior is not a determinant of sexual orientation or sexual identity. And recently, there's been a number of studies coming out of the United States that is looking at straight men who have sex with other men. So these are men that identify, their sexual identity is straight, and their sexual orientation is straight, yet their sexual behavior is other. They're having sex with other men. Now, I wanted to talk about the Kinsey Scale. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, Alfred Kinsey was a sexologist who founded the Institute for Sexual Research at Indiana University in 1947. Now, his research on sexuality led to the development of this scale when it was observed that sexuality occurs on a spectrum. So when they talk to people about their sexuality, they realized that people weren't exclusively homosexual or exclusively heterosexual. There was a spectrum on which people found themselves. Now, this scale measures sexual orientation, and remember that's your internal desire or attraction, and it runs from 0 to 6, with 0 indicating exclusive heterosexual and 6 indicating exclusive homosexual. Now, if we move in one, 1 indicates incidental homosexual desire, also known as heteroflexible, and 5 indicates incidental heterosexual desire, which is also known as homoflexible. The spaces 2 to 4 is where we see more than just incidental desire. Now, in the middle is where we would place most bisexuals. And in this range, we would also expect to find those individuals whose sexual orientation would either be pansexual or polysexual. Now, this is all fine, but it's missing one group, the ace community, or asexuality. Now, when it comes to the asexual spectrum, it runs from sexuality to asexuality, with gray A and demisexuality in the middle. Now, I want to just mention that in a 2015 study that was done at the University of Alberta here, in which they were looking at sexuality, more people in that study identified as asexual than they did either as gay or lesbian. So it is quite prevalent. People are identifying and understanding themselves as asexual beings. Now, it's not that asexual people don't engage in sexual activity. Rather, as a sexual orientation, what asexual individuals experience is more of a lack of sexual attraction or desire to engage in sex with others. So rather than sexual orientation guiding the attraction, asexual individuals experience more of a romantic attraction. And like everything else we're talking about tonight, romantic attraction also occurs on a spectrum. So you can be homoromantic, panromantic, biromantic, or aromantic, where the romantic attraction is limited or doesn't exist at all. Now, what does romantic attraction entail? So this could be going on dates, being affectionate for each other, holding hands, being intimate, sharing experiences, and for some, this might also include kissing and cuddling. It also can include sexual behavior, and for some, that sexual behavior is exclusive to creating children. Now, when it comes to the middle section, gray asexual individuals fall into this area between sexuality and asexuality, and it's that their sexual attraction to someone just happens to be very rare. So it can happen, but it does not happen with high frequency. Whereas demisexual, on the other hand, is used for individuals who only form a sexual attraction after they've formed a close emotional connection with that person. So, moving on, we have the purple-red scale of attraction. Now, this scale expands on the Kinsey scale of integrating who you are attracted to with how you are attracted to them. So you'll see Kinsey scale identified by the numbers 0 to 6. It's opposite to the early graph, which had exclusive heterosexual attention on the left. Now, what's added here are the different types of attraction. Starting from the bottom, A is aromantic sexuality, where there's no romantic or sexual attraction. B refers to romantic asexuality, where there's no sexual attraction, but there is romantic attraction. C is tertiary sexuality, where there's no sexual attraction, but engages in behavior for the purposes of relationship or to have kids. D is secondary sexuality, where the sexual attraction exists, but not at first. Remember, demisexuals. In terms of the letter E, this refers to primary sexuality, where sexual attraction is there from the get-go, even if it's not acted upon. However, other components, such as companionship, are essential and an integral part of this attraction. And finally, F stands for hypersexuality, where sex is the be-all, end-all of the relationship and is the only defining factor. So given that, you can kind of figure out where you fit into this scale. I would place myself as an E5, maybe closer to an E6, but I'll leave that with you to explore. And just before we finish off, and I start the video, I just want to express that the sexual and gender minority, while we've come a long way in terms of rights for this group of people, they still face incredible amounts of oppression and discrimination across all facets of their life. So this puts them at risk for increased experience of depression, anxiety, addiction, self-esteem. They are the targets of bullying, which can hugely impact their self-worth and their self-esteem. There was one large study that came out of the United States, and from that study, it was reported that a staggering 41% of respondents reported attempting suicide. 41%, compared to 1.6% of the general population. So I hope that gives you an understanding of the risk that these people still face in their day-to-day lives. Now, I want to just click out of here and bring up this video, which, as I said earlier, really integrates sexuality and gender in a kind of holistic and different way. So I hope you enjoy. And I hope you can hear it.
Hey. Hi there. What's going on? What's going around? Okay. I like to flirt. In fact, I may have been born to flirt.
Grant, why don't you take the volume button at the bottom and make sure that it's on high? It's hard to hear.
What do you think?
Sorry, Nicole?
On the left, your volume button under the red dot there, to see if it's all the way up.
Yeah.
And
It
how
is.
do you think I want you to think of me? Heterosexual, homosexual, male, female? And do you need to know the answers to those questions?
I can't hear the video, so I'm just going to engage other people. If you want to use the chat button, let me know if you can hear the video that Grant is playing.
I mean the real question. Okay, well, me, I'm not so crazy about claims on reality. What I'd much rather do is tell you a story. Stephanie Arnold was my undergraduate theater professor.
Here we
How's
go.
that?
Smart,
Perfect,
feminine,
thank you. Do you want to
compassionate
rewind it, Grant?
teacher
I will.
that made you
Yeah.
genuinely want
That's
to try to
perfect.
impress her.
Even a little more if you can. Whatever you did. Thank you.
Hey. Hi there. What's going on? What's going round? Okay. I like to flirt. In fact, I may have been born to flirt. But for me, flirting always leads to questions. So here's a few for you. What do you think? Am I a man or a woman? And given that, who do you think I want to flirt with? And how do you think I want you to think of me? Heterosexual, homosexual, male, female? And do you need to know the answers to those questions in order for it to be okay for me to flirt with you? I mean the real questions. Okay, well, me, I'm not so crazy about claims on reality. What I'd much rather do is tell you a story. Stephanie Arnold was my undergraduate theater professor. Smart, feminist, compassionate. She was the kind of teacher that made you genuinely want to try to impress her. And when you were good, I mean really, really good, Stephanie Arnold gave you the nod. But in 1989, Stephanie Arnold had a problem. Her department was in chaos. All hell was breaking loose. The actresses were crying in class. The actors were skipping rehearsal. Fights were breaking out. Stephanie Arnold was not happy. And at the heart of it all was one student. And that student was me. Now, in 1989, I was your pretty typical Northwest college chick. I wore hippie skirts and cowboy boots. I had long flowing hair. I liked open mic poetry night and flirting with everyone. But when push came to shove, when a flirt met the futon, I confused people. See, I didn't look like a guy, but I didn't act like a girl. The girls didn't expect me to hit on them. The guys didn't expect me to be the one who didn't want to spend the night. And nobody expected all three of us to, well, you get the picture. In the end, they all wanted to know, what are you, really? Heterosexual? Homosexual? Male? Female? I just really didn't know what to tell them. And unfortunately, that was a problem for all of us. So one day, I tried an experiment. I walked into the theater with a completely new look. In my military flat top and man suit, I have to say, I felt sexier than I ever had before. On the street, 3 different people had called me sir. In the green room, that girl who'd never given me the time of day winked at me and finally said hi. And on that fateful day, Stephanie Arnold herself walked out of her office, looked me over, smiled, and for the very first time, gave me the nod. This is it, that moment said. This is the answer. And it seemed to make all kinds of sense to my teacher, to my friends, to the people on the street. But I still had some questions. So I did my research. I looked up the Kinsey Scale of human sexual behavior. Now, interviewing people about their sexual histories, Kinsey found that people's actions and desires are not necessarily consistent across time. And many people identify as heterosexual or homosexual, but when asked, reveal behaviors and thoughts that are really somewhere in between. So looking at bisexuality, I found the Klein Sexual Orientation Grid, which identifies 7 different vectors of sexual orientation and gender identity separately, and further delineates them by one's past, one's present, and one's ideal future. Looking at gender identity, I found Egan and Perry's multidimensional gender identity model, which factors in 5 major components of one's sense of self. Do you think you belong to a gender category? Feel typical inside of it? Feel content? Feel pressure to conform to it? And even, do you feel superior to the opposite gender category? I realized that there's a whole lot of spectrums going on, no matter who's flirting with who. But I'm not a scientist. What I really wanted was a story. And none of these scales and measurements really gave me the answer the theater department was looking for anyway. Who am I, really? I mean, in that moment, did Stephanie Arnold's nod, did it validate the real me? Or did my haircut and my suit jacket give me a role that Stephanie Arnold finally knew how to cast? I mean, I know for me in that moment, Stephanie Arnold's approval gave me strength I badly needed to stand tall. But at the same time, I really don't think anybody could convince me to say, not be a flirt. So truly, was I born this way? Or with a different kind of encouragement, could I have been something else altogether? Now, every actor knows that the script is just the beginning of the play. And looking at our lives, I know that flat lines are simply not enough. So I would like to suggest that our sexual orientation and our gender identity are not determined on a linear scale. Rather, I'd like to suggest a much more flexible model, where masculinity and femininity are different parts of an identity circle, and heterosexuality and homosexuality are different parts of a sexuality circle. And what you think I am and what I think I am are in constant geometrical tension, always adjusting, always in motion, making up the 3 dimensions of the possibility of me. Because truly all 3 circles are in motion, right? I mean, the scale itself is always changing. What it means to be male or female changes, right? I mean, gay didn't used to be an identity. It used to be an activity. And if all of these things are true, if really our terms are invented as well as ourselves, then you and me and circumstance and biology are all in this together. And no matter who you are, no matter how typical or how queer, we're all of us positioning ourselves all of the time. And at any given moment, on any given circumference, you might find yourself outside the sphere or smack dab in the circle, but there's always movement and there's always potential for change. So really, why not? Improvise a little. Don't be afraid to flirt with a possibility every now and then. And in any given moment, if you find yourself witness to an exemplary version of someone else's story, don't miss the opportunity to nod. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed that. I just remembered that there was one thing that I forgot to address in my talk, and I'm just gonna rifle through to the end here, because I also wanted to, where is it? Talk about the Gingerbread Person. This is a great learning tool. It's a great tool for exploration about yourself. I use it quite often with clients. There's another one. There's also the, I think it's a unicorn that you can find online. And there's also the identity spectrum, which looks like this. And again, you can just, plot your way through here and see where you lie. It's a good way of...
Links to a few of these and PDFs on the website with the video too, hey?
Great, yes, we'll do that. And so, with that, I would like to, where do I go here? New share. There. So, let's go to questions, if anyone has any.
No questions yet. If you want to type one, if you need a minute, there's also, you can raise your hand so we know that you've got a question coming. Just to give folks maybe a couple of minutes to type a question if they have one. What kinds of, when clients come to see you, because I know you see a lot of clients and work in this area, what kinds of concerns or questions or issues are you seeing, Grant? What are people's struggles?
I see a lot of clients who struggle with a positive sense of identity. Mm-hmm. So clients struggling with either internal homophobia or internal gender phobia. And a lot of this comes from familial messages, societal messages saying over and over as these individuals are growing up that you're not good enough, you're wrong, it's not okay to be different. Mm-hmm. And so I see that as a lot of, and that with these individuals, that in and of itself can cause really a lot of struggle in terms of self-identity, self-respect, self-worth, which carries over into every aspect of these individuals' lives.
Mm-hmm. We might not have any questions tonight, Grant.
Doesn't look like it.
Looks like you've done a very good job of answering people's questions. Grant's email's on the website as well. I assume it would be okay if people have a question.
Yes.
Contact.
Yeah. Please don't be afraid to reach out if you have any questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. And again, we would love to have you at any of our talks or webinars. And I'll make sure you get the link for Grant's talk tonight. And I wish you all a very good evening.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Grant.
Thank you.